If we say that we are beings that are made out of matter energy in the third dimension, that undergoes change that we measure as being the fourth dimension, and also if we say that time is like a holographic hypercube underlying the third dimension, that is the shadow of a spatial object in the fourth dimension, then we can safely say that light is the fifth dimension, measured as the speeds of a photon, and whose substance, just as probability wells in a field of pure potential are the substance of the fourth dimension, is gravitational tachyon microwave radiation. We have already established that tachyons move faster than photons, so to say that the speed of the photon is the measure of the fifth dimension is like saying that entropy in the third dimension is the only way to measure the temporal fourth dimension. This introduces an important concept, that time moves faster than matter energy, and that light moves faster than time. This is to say that matter becomes energy when it reaches the speed of light, and that this is the backbone of the flow of entropy from past to future, or the measure of the concept of time. Because tachyons move faster than this speed, they do not obey the forward-flowing arrow of entropy, or what we call time. The universe began in the first dimension. There was a microwave vibration that occurred under the influence of uncertainty, and this caused everything. A single amount of the void spun around itself and split off, forming the first particle of karma, or quantum information unit. This particle was a singularity compared to nothing, and thus was compelled about itself with all the combined weight of the fullness of the abyss, which was a great greatness. It was forced to begin to consume itself by the emptiness, and this it did with such haste that it began to implode with a force greater than that of the darkness, that is, that velocity known as the speed of a photon, and thus to bend the space-time within it, as it had been bent from the null space and zero time of the void when it was conceived. This turned it inside out quickly, and filled it with light, so that it shone then in the pitch. But these were not rays of photons, too slow in the darkness, and too easily consumed would they be, but the projection of hyperspace light, that is, the microwave gravity particle tachyons, and these are projected as an outward rippling orb. Then it was the time of the second dimension, when the waves of tachyon luminous microwave gravity stirred the void up into action and caused more reactions than created particles. These are the events when the four forces were set down, and everything had been called into spin. Time began then, as a measurement of the spinning at a speed that could be measured by the velocity of a photon. Space was conception itself. A single point in null space would be drawn out and then turned about itself, creating polarity. A particle would spring into existence as a self-expanding wormhole, a tachyon torus in the vast expanse of the nether realm, and immediately generate a stream of similar shapes that would continue on filling in the darkness until they were all a solid throng occupying a region and causing, by their continual exchange of motion between them, which asymptotically approached regulation, the oscillation of that great polarizing force we know as time. These tachyons tended to accumulate themselves then in a topical aura, or field, since they were emanating outward from a center, and so their region of most profound discourse was around the edge of their expansion. It is upon the surface of this three-dimensional shape, expanding in the fourth spatial dimension, that the story of our universe continues. By this time, the four elemental genres of particles had been formed, and this had given the light a fine quality, invisible to the darkness, that of all those less intense manifest fluctuations of particles slower than the speed of light. This was the material universe that was becoming polarized as three-dimensional space on the surface of the fourth-dimensional inflation of tachyons. Once the third dimension began to appear out of the pure heat following the Big Bang, it rapidly accumulated masses in space similar to those underlying its own mechanisms of creation. These are, in order ascending outwards from our planet, stars, galaxies, and the walls and voids. The planets and the stars are spheres, the stars emitting light and the planets reflecting it. The orbits of the planets around the stars and the orbits of stars around the centers of galaxies are both planar, that is, purely based on the polarization principle, that elemental opposites attract. In the case of stars and planets, this means the star is too weak to attract heavier objects than the solidification of the fine layers of the gas cloud that surrounded it before its fire scorched them, making them curl up into spheres. In the case of stars, in galaxies, it is that those bastions of the lesser light all fall towards and are caught in the wake of a singularity where microwave gravity has torn a hole in space-time, leading at the edges into hyperdimension, and in the center to the abyss outside. The walls and voids arrange themselves in random strands and gaps, the extended projection of the first spurts of probability in the infinite field of potential. The fourth dimension gives us time. This is the surface upon which we measure a beam of light as it is guided. It is homogeneous to the very small and the very large, though we recognize these terms to be relative to our perception, and it makes the smaller particles to move faster and the larger spheres to move slower, although we can project our understanding of the relativity of size onto the relativity of temporal durations. Again, it is only the measure of the averaged frequency over wavelength for an area given as pi squared, or a factor of microgravity, the force that causes all points in the universe to expand apart from each other, as microgravity is perpetually self-generative and repulsively charged toward matter energy, being as it is on the degree of frequency where it is thought to be so improbable for it to exist in the confines of our universe. In the presence of its finer aspect, the larger solid particles or the longer wavelengths of energy, and the likelihood of it is so infinitesimal that it is called antimatter, or otherwise bordering on being opposite possible reality. The formula for time is thus given as phi over pi. That is the formula for a hypercube that is contained within and surrounding a sphere, that it is set to work measuring the difference of that sphere, so that as the sphere expands, so does the hypercube. On the day of the fifth dimension, let there be light, for as we are given to know of consciousness and sleep, and of day and night, so too do we know of the nature of photons and tachyons. In the proper conditions, tachyons can be observed in the three-dimensional matter-energy universe, where, true to form, they can be measured by instruments before the time it would take a photon resultant from the same events from which they derived to arrive. In these cases, we see that they are able to utilize the same factor of the uncertainty of existence as a probability in potential to quantum tunnel through all larger, slower solids, moving from one point on the surface of an electron cloud to a point exactly on the opposite side, not by going through the center of the atom, nor by following a curve defined by the orbit of its electron, but by passing into and then out of the electron itself, which can be at all points on its orbital shell at any time, where it does not manifest trajectory spin as a probability, like a photon being absorbed or emitted by an electron, but warp spin, as it is swallowed up into itself between the 2 points, consumed in hyperspace, where the point it disappeared and the point it reappeared are the same point, and the tachyon wormhole itself fills the space between them, such that spin is conserved by the tachyon. The realm of hyperdimension, or the hyper-real warping of the fabric of space-time so that it is always consuming and regenerating itself simultaneously, is the surface of a geometry in pure dimension also, and this is the origin of spin-wave mechanics. In the 6th dimension there is potential light, that is, the absence of space as a continuum of vortices, and the absence of time as this substance in motion. Here is the dark pit from whence we started. It is the black hole of the larger cosmos that ours lives within, between which various frequencies of microwave vibrations are shared, though it only looks light because the light of spin burning off pure potential that is our universe is so dim compared to the speed and involution of the greater light of this field, equivalent to the electromagnetic torus surrounding the gravitational singularity of a black hole as we know them, on the inside of which wormholes to alternate realities form. Thus it is truly here, in the quantum foam of spontaneously upsurging probabilities, that we see the connection points between such wormholes form as a gravitational micro-wavelength that is the history of a single tachyon, known as a transcendent tachyon, because it occupies all points in this micro-wavelength history simultaneously, and thus we see how our own universe formed as well. The 7th dimension is that of potential information, where all pure data is truly relative, and thus this is said to be the dimension of dimensions, that is, the one dimension containing the differing geometries of all the others, and providing for them a basis for that continuous contiguity. It is for this reason, for example, that we can say there is no division between multiverses in hyperdimension, where the geometry governs fine waveforms. For the same reason there are different divisions in the manifest realm of basic matter-energy exchange governed by entropy. So there is subspace, so there is hyperspace in hyperdimension, the hyper-reality of the multiverse, and so there is the pure dimension of the primary clear light called Yalem. To this end, they say, that the Creator rested. It is the standard course of entropy that energy is given off by matter as long as the matter is cohesive. This is an effect of the electrons bonding the nuclei of the atoms that comprise matter together. Molecules are formed by electrons joining the circumferences of their orbits, while their atomic nuclei remain far apart. Gradually, random quantum fluctuations break some of these bonds and form new ones. The matter begins to deteriorate as the electron shell tends to break up more than rejoining. When energy escapes the macromolecules of a living organism, it does not necessarily do so in the form of raw electrons. Most of the energy is given off in the form of body heat or thermal radiation. This means basically that the electrons spin off from their orbits and become wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation. These waves are high energy and therefore warm and heat the air around them, causing miniature isobars of pressure to convect molecules of air asymptotically transversely. Most of the electron shell decay in this category escapes from carbohydrates, ash water, or acidic macromolecules derived from fats and lipids. A certain proportion of electron orbital bonding decay in matter molecules is due to exposure to wavelengths of radiation. The closer the wavelength of radiation gets to matching the diameter of the constituent particles, the more probable their cohesion will be disturbed by it. The radioactive decay from nuclear isotopes, because the alpha and beta waves are equal to the size of different atoms, particularly common in organic materials such as living tissue, is considered to be the most dangerous form of such radiation, though the sun that we rely on for daylight is nothing other than a huge nuclear furnace burning off a gas cloud floating through space. Although this process is very slow and gradual, it is responsible for most of the molecular decomposition that occurs throughout the universe. Photons and the orbital shells of electrons are of nearly the same size. However, when a photon strikes an electron's orbital shell, it causes the electron to shrink to a singular charge at the point of the photon's impact on the orbital shell. The photon bounces off in an angled trajectory, carrying as a function of its wavelength the holographically stored information of the electron's spin. This has resulted in the modern scientific quagmire of only being able to tell the projected trajectory, or spin, of an electron by measuring its collision with a photon. Whenever this happens, it increases the probability of the electron breaking its orbit and destroying the molecular cohesion between its nucleus and another atom. There is such a thing as the conservation of angular momentum, and this law of physics states that an object in motion or set in motion by being acted upon by another object has a predictable trajectory. There is also the conservation of energy, which states that there is a fixed amount of ambient energy in the universe, and that none is ever created or destroyed. Therefore, when electrons are liberated from their atomic orbits, by whatever means, in whatever way, their transformation from mass into frequency is measured by the geometrical equivalent of their probabilistic dispersal. Thus, the speed of a photon, a real particle that carries a charge and is similar in size to an electron, potential energy, cloud, the orbital shell around the nucleus, is arranged in a second-dimensional, the orbit of the singular charge in the potential cloud, square field around the source of the energy's liberation. It is thought that, since it is equally likely for the energy to disperse in any direction, and since photons as particles mimic the behavior of waves as fields and are equally probable to travel in all directions, the quantity of the electron charge is thought to disperse equally throughout the pattern of radiative particle velocity. So it is said that the photon and electron are equivalent in potential. In natural data, we can observe this rule, expressed as mass times light speed squared equals energy, to hold true, and thus it has become an accepted axiom of physics, known as the theory of special relativity. The title of relativity derives from the second-dimensional geometric relativity between the orbital path of the singular charge in the orbital shell of an electron cloud and the trajectory of the projected photon. The successful proof of this special relativity led to the grander general theory of relativity, which attempted to show that, using the accepted relativity between distance and duration, time and space are relative. Those people who have not devoted thought to penetrating the full amount of meaningful, true and real implications there are in this simple formula are, for the most part, happy to accept the, until recently blasphemous, notion that matter, the self, and energy, the soul or spirit, are really one and the same thing. While it is amusing to allow people this delusion, it is important to remember that this is not an exactly accurate interpretation of the data. It is true, by rigorous extension of the theorem, that earlier in the evolution of the universe, matter and energy were unified, in that there was no matter, And because the radiation that there was so high frequency, it surpassed the modern parameters for the definition of energy. Because the theory was strictly derived from energy liberation, it has only been very recently, with the use of particle accelerators, that we begin to be able to conceive of the complete inversion of this flow of entropy necessary for the genesis of matter. In the same way that a particle accelerator speeds up quanta and then collides them so they explode, so has the theory responsible for their being built thrown off and exploded many modern myths. One of these is the backbone of the idea of time itself, the standard forward-flowing arrow of entropy, or the measure of molecular decay. According to classical physics before special relativity, electron clouds bond with one another less frequently than when they are separated, and this accounts for the eventual decohesion of all existent physical form. It was even known that matter took on different forms, and even had different particles, according to the four elemental forces. The most popular attempt at unification of the four elements was known as cosmos to the ancient Greeks, the philosopher's stone to the alchemists, and ether to astrophysicists. This was essentially an additional, unknown force, or possibly a higher dimension. After special relativity, doors opened up for cosmologists to root out the source of the division between the elemental forces comprising modern matter and energy, and seek the elusive original ether. While the conservation of energy is seen to apply now, the Big Bang, or the cosmology of relativity, shows mathematically that at some time in our ancient past, the high-energy ether did appear out of nowhere, and that over time, as the universe has cooled, this slowed down into what we now know as energy, and even slowed down further into what we call matter. Fluid mechanics supports this, showing that the molecules of a liquid will move faster, boil, with more radiation, heat, and slower with less. Most recently, quantum mechanics, the offspring particle physics school of special relativity, has unearthed the mechanism by which they believe the energy of the universe first came into existence, and then gradually cooled and became more solid, as well as why this solidity is temporary, and matter eventually turns back into energy. This aptly named uncertainty principle is nothing more than the mathematical description of the original quandary of special relativity, the relationship between the solid particle of the photon and the virtual particle of the electron. The centralized, real particles of matter and the decentralized, virtual waves of energy are the only two types for which substantive quantum data have been found studying the four elemental forces arising from the known laws of physics, believed to be generalizable universally. Through the functioning of these components in accordance with the geometrical physics of the elemental forces, we see that the real particles do gradually degenerate into energy wavelengths, and that the energy is liberated and disperses into a field of potential defined in its parameters by the speed of light. Thus we have seen how matter seems to become energy, though we know that all that is defined as matter, due to structure, is really a function of energy. Therefore, the sum of all particles combined with the sum of all waves is a quantity of potential energy. Quantum wave packets of energy follow geometric patterns relative to one another, and this force causes the assembly of the elemental atoms as well as their combination in molecules. In the same way, an atom is made up of a particle-like nucleus and a wave-like electron, so the particle-like nucleus is made of particle-like quarks and wave-like gluons. The electron exists as a charged point dispersed in an orbital cloud of potential until acted upon by a particle, such as a photon. The electron cloud is, like the individual photon to the entire wavelength of light, a fractal part that carries the pattern of the whole, in this case an electromagnetic field, such as exists around the Earth or Sun. Such electromagnetic fields are defined by polarity, and this creates a torus shape. This is only known because ions have been sped up towards the speed of light in particle colliders until they fell apart, and the trajectories of their constituent components, the short-lived quanta called antimatter that trigger electromagnetic energy release cascades when they come in contact with a real particle, are measured as a function of their internal composition. When the nucleus of an atom is split, the wave packets that it emits trigger energy liberation cascades, displacing the internal quanta of surrounding real particles, such as other atomic nuclei, and causing them to become radioactive, so strongly electromagnetically charged that particle decay occurs, emitting wavelengths the size of atomic nuclei that further destabilize molecular cohesion. When special relativity first demonstrated that cause and effect relationships occurred between particles and waves, one of the first uses it was put to was a bomb. The military mentality that self-loathing is sufficient motive for murder of those reminiscent of one's own undesired qualities was quick to apply special relativity to the building of an atomic bomb ignited by a controlled implosion. The destructive capacity of this weapon was expected to ensure the peace by outweighing the impetus for war. Although such weapons of mass destruction have been and are still being developed by multiple nations around the world, the tacit globalism of the economic media has arisen, binding the people together in agreement not to destroy the whole earth over their individual differences. The attempts at theories of a unified field, since special relativity, have all been based on tracing the origin of matter, since it is from the time of the first substance that derives the division of the four elemental forces governing the laws of physics. This is the case because fermions, the particles of the electromagnetic and, it is thought, gravitational forces, cannot yet be artificially combined to form bosons, the particles of the strong and weak nuclear forces, only derived from them by particle decay caused by random electromagnetic inversions in probability or particle collision. Therefore, the substance of the unified field, the ether, has come to be called space-time, and thought to be best observed in extreme events of gravitational distortion, where the other surrounding forces become warped. Here it is seen, or rather can be measured, that the particles and wave packets of the other elemental forces can all be accelerated to the speed of light, and, it can be mathematically proven, even break the light barrier. According to the increasingly accepted theorems using special relativity describing these black holes, the gravitational singularity at their center is the same substance as the universe before the beginning of the division of the four elements. Black holes are black because they absorb light, and to do this they must be able to accelerate it beyond the fastest speed of the electromagnetic spectrum. When the geometric fabric of the electromagnetic spectrum itself, such as the speed of photons being a fixed constant, is warped, this dissolves all real particles more rapidly than the weak nuclear force, even the photon itself, which has no scholastically known constituent components. Because the gravity well of a singularity can be so strong that it can crush a photon, it has no difficulty reaching photons with its pull, and speeding them up towards it. So too does it accelerate other particles to nearly the speed of light, causing nearly infinite particle collisions or nuclear fusion, stronger than the strong nuclear force. The only thing that escapes black holes does so due to the uncertainty principle of relativity, stating that the vacuum of pure potential undergoes random quantum inversions producing probabilities. This is thought to be the cause of the Big Bang. What is emitted is an extremely high frequency microwavelength. It is possible, using the measure of the characteristics of these microwaves, to determine the nature of the singularity emitting them. The study of quantum mechanics delves into the nature of both particle and wave. While a particle is solid and a wave transmits formless force, they do have many features in common. Both can be measured as statistical probabilities. In the same way that a particle remains a statistical probability for as long as it exists, a wave can appear as a probability or as a potential. The wave function, otherwise entirely mathematical, possesses one physical feature: the dimensionality of its wavelength. So do particles possess a combination of directions in which they spin. These can all be combined and their sum expressed in a single dimension as a prime exponent. In the same way that most real particles are actually comprised of energy waves, so is spin mathematically equivalent to a wavelength of energy. The proof of this is in the disruptive effect from exposure of real particles to virtual radiation. The spin of real particles is, in truth, the measure of vector, movement of a surface point over duration, expressed as a function of three planes of dimension. Two of these describe directions a spherical particle can rotate, while the third describes the trajectory of the real particle's angular momentum. The dimensionality derived from vector spin is equivalent to frequency of energy. The dimensionality derived from trajectory spin is equivalent to wavelength of energy. Just as a photon is the packet of information, frequency, received at the end of a ray of variable distance, wavelength, so too is a tachyon that point of extension of an electromagnetic microwave moving faster than a photon. To call a tachyon electromagnetic would be similar to calling a photon particle the wavelength of a light ray. The spin of the photon is equal to the information of the wavelength of the light ray, and the spin of a tachyon is equal to the information of the microwavelength. The electromagnetism of the microwavelength itself is contingent upon the concept of it bearing a charge arising as a result of its frequency's fluctuation, and therefore a magnetic field arranged perpendicularly to the flow of the electrical current. Thus, to call the microwaves electromagnetic energy depends on whether or not they carry an electrical charge that can produce magnetic polarity, which is indicated by their structure as a wavelength, similar to the known wavelengths, waveforms, and fields of the electromagnetic spectrum. The microwave lengths are smaller than the point of charge of the electron when it is singularized, because they comprise the geometric vibrational framework underlying the electron's different possible orbital shell circumferences. By establishing orbital shells for the charge to occupy as potential, microwaves act like gravity. Therefore, while the microwaves look electromagnetic, because of their very short wavelengths and very high frequency, they do not so much act like electrons as act on electrons, and thus in the apparent form of gravity. The prevalent modern theory is that tachyon particles do possess ethereal energy, or what I have called elsewhere astral light. The reason for this is that particles, such as photons, when converted into phased waves of pulsed energy through solid media, can exhibit faster than light characteristic velocities, and therefore it is assumed that tachyons, which share this class of velocity, might also possess the electromagnetic charge characteristic to the accelerated subluminal particles. It should be remembered, however, that tachyons are of a quantifiably different dimension altogether, and should therefore be expected to possess qualitatively different traits. While modern theory does not argue over the notion of tachyons being commutative with subluminal electromagnetic and atomic radiation, it has postulated mathematically that tachyons accelerate their speed as they lose energy, which is the elegant contrapositive to the constant speed of light in a vacuum rule of relativity, which states that as subluminal matter increases velocity, it gains mass. This expectation of tachyons will likely be proven according to countless mathematical applications of the relativistic equations, and, during all that time, delay the true nature of tachyons being discovered by experimental physics. It should suffice to say that tachyons are visibly radiative as Cherenkov light emitted by photons. Since the light from one photon alone would not illuminate the entire volume of the universe, however, it is also safe to say that this illuminating energy wears out over distance. In this regard, we can say that the energy of tachyons, which is positively charged when emitted from photons, is negatively charged when absorbed into atomic nuclei, moving from a dynamic to a static state. The modern theory speculates that when a tachyon has burned off its Cherenkov radiation, what I elsewhere call astral light, it loses all of its energy and achieves infinite velocity, occupying every point on its gravitational micro-wavelength superstring history simultaneously. Such a tachyon is called a transcendental tachyon, and, having no energy, is referred to as zero-point energy, a category shared with certain scalar phased waves. The microwaves do not just travel through the electron cloud without disrupting it. They also move faster than light. Ordinarily, they are invisible as a result of this, and though the waves themselves are harmless, they are still believed by theoretical physicists to be associated with the explosive conclusion of the lesser, similar trajectories of antimatter, because breaking the light barrier goes against the observable laws of physics simply by being considered improbable. The only time it is possible to see, or rather to measure, these microwaves is when they are projected through a solid medium. Here it is seen that energy beginning as an electromagnetic charge can travel through the material substance by quantum tunneling faster than the speed of a photon traveling the same distance unimpeded. Here we might predict that the photon would win because it is larger, about the size of the electron cloud. However, because the microwave is generated from an originally electromagnetic source, it carries a charge that interacts with the electron. It does not compress the orbital cloud into a singular point of charge, as does the photon, but instead the microwavelength and the electron field interphase, and the microwave exits one side of the orbital shell at the same time as it is entering it from the opposite side. The reason for this complex effect is simple to explain. The particles at the tip of these microwaves, whose history forms the fractal waveform, involute. Tachyons turn inside out, and they do this continuously. They are doing this right now. When a tachyon contacts the surface of the electron's potential energy orbital cloud, the tachyon absorbs the pattern of the shell and moves through this geometry according to its own trajectory. In other words, when the tachyon and electron interphase, they combine to form a dimensional warp in the probabilistic continuum of space-time. This is how the tachyons travel faster than photons. Because of this, they are considered as moving counter to the flow of entropy, or the increase of disorder. This comparison again implies a false similarity between tachyons and antimatter, since the particles and waves that have been classified antimatter were all discovered as being generated by the decomposition of larger particles at speeds approaching the speed of light. However, the difference between the world below the speed of light and the world above it is like the difference between the world under the surface of the water in a fish pond, as opposed to the vast expanse of the world above. The saying goes, "Time flies when you're having fun." The conclusion of this by science is that time should always move at the same speed whether you are having fun or not, and that this speed should be roughly equivalent to the average between the rates at which it seems to move when you are having fun and when you are not. The quantum inversions from potential to probability that occur in the brain simultaneously to thoughts and stimuli interact with fields of tachyons through the left and right thalami of the thalamus, or reptile brain, since it is roughly to this stage in evolution that our reptilian genetic ancestors have evolved their consciousness. The interaction of mind and hyperlight opens up the doors of perception to the multiverse and its infinite dimensional planes or levels of reality. Since the interaction occurs in the holographic reception and reprojection areas of the central nervous system, and this is common to so many varying different types of life form on the planet, it is safe to say we should naturally be accustomed to dealing with this co-creative, interactive, ideal realm of spiritual experience, and I doubt that anything anybody has ever put into the drinking water would dilute this much. The idea that the mind and the cosmic continuum are relative does not lead immediately to perfectly honed manifestation. Instead, we see that humanity is constantly making sacrifices from the realm of potential to bring into materiality, and that the result of all of history's combined idealism remains relative to the environmental conditions of nature and setting. What this causes in the individual is defined as emotion, or a qualitative holonomonic similitude to the movement of objectivity relative to the fourth temporal dimension. Emotions often cycle in patterns as the electromagnetic ambience of the world changes around them. So it is thought that the tachyons that interact with our neural electrical stimulation obey fixed quantifiable rules, the same as the quanta of the four elemental forces. The belief that thoughts affect reality is at the very core of humanity. Our unique ability to grasp objects and make tools allows interaction with the environment in the form of direct physical causality, and we see every day the scale to which this has accumulated effect. The creation of materiality is not believed to be exclusive to our consciousness either. Religions tell us that even our thoughts result in karma. Elsewhere, I describe consciousness as potential extrapolated to the 10th dimension, at which point it finds itself reflected in the core of external consciousness. This makes tachyons, though they are sub-quanta, equivalent as the midpoint of dimensional consciousness to the division between the terrestrial left and spatial temporal right hemispheres of the brain in Leary's 8-circuit model. By applying the 7 hermetic axioms, we can see that tachyons obey the same set of rules as the mind, and that the two are, therefore, relative. In order to comprehend why the microwavelengths of tachyons can be measured as an emotional reaction, we must examine some examples of how tachyons interact with particles and waves. As I have already defined, the microwavelength histories of the involution of individual tachyon particles is an equivalent ratio of information to frequency of a wavelength of energy, or spin and trajectory of a particle of matter. This does not mean that they are all describing the same thing. Each is a characteristic function of the specific type of quantum information unit serving as the carrier of the micro pattern, or fractal, relationship to its individual behaviors. However, the role that each feature plays to its more general component is comparable to that of the others in this definitive capacity, and therefore the unit of measure for the parameters of the field for all these types of effect is the same: dimension. Just as an electromagnetic wavelength is composed of the plane of the electrical current and the perpendicular plane of magnetic polarity, expressed as the individual electron, composed of one rotation of these two dimensions, as the distinction between the polarized cloud and the single point charge, so also can the vector of a real particle be expressed in terms of the polar rotation and precession of axis path, even in the absence of externally induced trajectory. It is thought that, insofar as mind seems to be relative to time, tachyons represent two geometrically ideal dimensions as well. The photon is a massless particle about the size of an atom. Because it has no mass, when it strikes an atom, it does not cause the atom to move. Instead, the result is that the photon freezes the electron's negative charge at the point of contact, and then bounces off of it at an angle determined by the second-dimensional projected trajectory of the photon and the first-dimensional point vector of the electron. The reason that the electron is brought to a singular point in its orbital shell is that the spin of the photon is comprised of the dimensions of its past vector and its projected trajectory, and, according to the theory of the conservation of dimensionality, because the event of the photon's impact with the electron is of the minimum possible duration, the electron can only contribute one dimension within three-dimensional space. It therefore drops the dimensionality of its orbital trajectory and reacts only as an electrical charge of magnetic polarity, or as a repulsive point. This is enough for the real particle of the photon to react physically to the electron's orbital cloud of potential energy, but not enough to contribute any significant change to the trajectory besides accelerating or diminishing wavelength frequency, that is, changing the color of the visible light. And even this is only by a factor determined by a function of what the wavelength history of the photon particle's projected trajectory was before striking the electron. Not all photons are reflected from all electrons. When electrons are built up into different shell-numbered atoms, the likelihood varies as to whether they will be reflected or absorbed. When a photon is absorbed, the electron changes its orbital shell level to a higher energy level. Because the photon has no electrical charge, then we must look to tachyons to explain why this effect occurs. Tachyons are the commonality of electrons and photons. In electrons, they occur as the microwavelengths emanating from the nucleus, upon the peaks and troughs of which form the electron's energy level orbital shells. In photons, tachyons occur as the microwavelengths emanating from it that distort the surrounding space, making the photon appear visibly radiant. It is the information of these microwavelength frequencies that is being exchanged between the dimensions of the photon and the electron, and that determine how both will react. If the microwavelengths are a certain distance from the nucleus of the atom and carrying a certain amount of electrical charge, determined by the number of electrons occupying each orbital shell, the probability cloud will either reflect or absorb the capacity for potential microwavelength propagation of the photon. To say that the microwavelengths are generated by the photon is not exactly accurate. Instead, what we are seeing in the photon is a lightless, real particle traveling through a continuum of potential microwavelengths that are traveling in all directions. Those that pass through the real particle of the photon become probabilities while inside of it. This has an effect on the substance of the photon similar to heating it, and this causes the photon to glow. Other than black holes and particle accelerators, it is not known what can produce tachyons in the material universe. It is possible that the substance of the universe before the division of the four elemental forces consisted entirely of potential tachyons. This seems in keeping with the Buddhist description of the primary clear light of Yalem, the substance they believe pre-existed the universe. These micro-wavelengths, when looked at head-on, are tiny tori whose insides move opposite their outsides. Thus, they are moving through time in both directions at once. Their frequency determines the structural geometry of the different dimensions, and these lay down the laws of physics that compile quantum information unit particles for each of the 4 divisions of their elemental, involuting, transdimensional, multi-vibrational forces. Thus, they can be seen to cause our reality. We have seen that, for the most part, that is, except in situations where special relativity applies, energy and matter are separate forms of substance that do not combine or subtract from one another, but act independently of each other. If time itself were stopped in a single event for the entire universe, there would be no matter-energy exchange between real particles and virtual waves. We see also that 2 spin 1/2 electrons don't make a spin 1 photon, even though both are forms of micro-wavelengths, and that even the different types of quarks in a nucleus are bound together by real, whole number spin quanta gluons. So, to say that the photon and the electron, as well as the quarks, pions, mesons, and gluons in the nucleus, are all structures founded on micro-wavelengths of energy, is similar to comparing day and night. However, what we are seeing by day or by night is the same scene. We are only seeing it differently. So it is with particles and waves upon the shores of time. The concept of a unified field has been expressed in as many different terms as drugs, in as many different cultures. Both are like an elephant in the living room of society, that everyone knows exists, but for which no one claims responsibility. Both are natural realities irrelevant of the ones who discover them or live by their light. The Hindus had a concept of energy that they called Maya, measured by karma, which was the earliest known concept of energy. The Chinese called this energy Qi, and its cycling Tao, and the Egyptians identified it with Ptah, the energy unifying the Ka and the Ak in the 7 vessels of the Ba, and it is probably due to their practice of keeping the extruded organs of their mummified dead in canopic jars that from this word we derive the sound for spitting. The Hebrews associated such power with the Ophanim wheels, and the Catholics with the Holy Ghost, while the Buddhists compared it to enlightenment. The Aryans of the Caucasus called this energy Thul, and the Maya called it manna, which was also the Hebraic Greek word for bread. At the turn of the 20th century, it was identified as orgone energy by Wilhelm Reich, and associated with scalar waves discovered by Nikola Tesla. Most recently, the heads of the SS of the Third Reich based their research of it on a description of Vril energy in a science fiction novel. Currently, such micro-wavelengths have been said to be the cause of gravity by Robert Lazar, who claims to have learned of this while working on government-classified alien aircraft. The term tachyons is common on Star Trek, the science fiction TV series set in a future where many particles that remain theoretical today have been discovered and applied for human space travel. The other most popular science fiction series of modern times are the Star Wars movies, where the characters can perform telekinesis using the Force, an all-powerful energy field that surrounds all things in the universe, binds them together, and makes them grow. What is our future is guided by the light of what is the universe's past. What one person thinks another person is just going to have to learn is the same as what the other person thinks that person is going to have to learn. Other than this, there is no psychological structure to time. People's minds think like they are stuck in tunnel realities and measure the amount of similarity from moment to moment as karma, burdened by their own prejudice against themselves. There is little enjoyable about beating oneself over the head with the weight of the world. We should not allow ourselves, in light of tachyons, to see light as equivalent to gravity. Matters of enlightenment are not the same topics as those considered gravitas by the old Roman prelates. Tachyons, a particle of radiation off the scale of the electromagnetic spectrum, may carry the force of gravity, and they may be wound up so tightly that they generate the emission of luminosity. But the ideals of light and gravity are as different as the Buddhist conception of the primary clear light, utterly free of all consciousness, and the Judeo-Christian God, the anthropomorphism of that consciousness. I say this because I do not wish to foresee a future in which ideation, which occurs on an equivalent scale to micro-wavelength tachyons, is considered the result of pressurization. This is for the reason that, as people progress closer to a complete understanding of genetics, and immortality becomes an increasing possibility, the functions of the birth experience, as described by Stan Grof, a student of consciousness researcher Timothy Leary, should no longer be considered the imprint of the mental engram of the experience of mortality as a tunnel reality. If we become immune to death, we will only lose the eternal changing of our voice, as we begin to speak with the voice of an intelligence beyond the times. This is why much of metaphysics throughout history has been classified by the occult orders that have kept their scientific legislations secret. For example, we know that an atomic clock outside the atmosphere and one inside it at ground level run at different speeds, due to the force of negentropic microwave gravity, and we know that the United States military stealth bomber can fly at altitudes above the end of the oxygenated area of the atmosphere. The stealth bomber is little more than a very expensive boomerang, going through temporal wormholes in space-time. On the other hand, it would do the uninitiated little good to scoff at real spacecraft, even if only as a sign of modernity. Similarly, it is important to embrace the craft signs of the builders, and to see them as alike keys to unlocking the greater understanding of all. At the turn of the 20th century, a young occultist named Aleister Crowley translated and elaborated upon an Egyptian stele from the British Museum collection. Although what probably caught the young man's attention was that its catalog number was 666, and he may have been attracted to its apocalyptic Christian numerology. He would claim that his expanded translation was dictated to him by an audible voice of which he could not distinguish the source. He was not alone in this experience at that time, as Nikola Tesla would also claim to be in contact with off-world sources through his first radio transmission towers, and it is a proven fact today that even the radiation of sunspots affects broadband transmissions. In this text, called the Book of the Law, the original Egyptian author, a scribe named Ra-Hor-Khuit, writing for Hor-Pa-Krat, who Crowley believed to be Harpocrates, describes three ages of humanity: the age of the mother, the age of the father, and the age of the son. The age of the mother was said to have ended with the beginning of civilization. The age of the father was marked by paternal authorities. According to Crowley, the age of the crowned and conquering child began in 1905 with his transcription of the book. This work would set the tone for the 20th century as an age of more rapid technological progress in a shorter amount of time than ever before in recorded history. This is truly a new age. In Crowley's lifetime, the world would be unified as social movements swept across the face of the globe like changing expressions of the emotions of the masses. 2 world wars would bring the planet almost to the brink of total destruction. The special theory of relativity was applied to intercontinental thermonuclear missiles, and humanity introduced the fear of the man pushing the button. Crowley himself would go on to become one of the heads of the Golden Dawn, a New Age occult order that resurrected Rosicrucian alchemy and applied it to the Enochian system of John Dee. Crowley himself was active in an Oriental influx into the order, introducing the practice of Kundalini Tantric Yoga as useful in ritual invocation of the angelic hosts. He would go on to join and restructure a Freemasonic lodge called the Ordo Templi Orientis, and arise to the degree of Ipsissimus, or outer head of the order. Towards the end of his lifetime, Crowley had written the Book of Thoth, illustrating the Shamhamphorash with the Tarot, or Rotos, Wheel of Karma. Using this temporal system, the precession of the equinoxes can be measured. Thus, by the end of his life, Crowley had unified the theory of the ages of humanity with the 2,000-year-long ages of each sign of the zodiac, as the sun rises in a different one then, at the same time of year. According to the precession of the equinoxes, in the amount of time it takes the Earth's axis to be changed relative to the direction of the sun from one point in its orbit to the opposite point in its orbit, there is an ice age for either the southern or the northern hemisphere, depending on which pole faces away from the sun as the planet's axis moves relative to its orbit. Currently, sunrise on the winter solstice is aligning with galactic core, as visible from the north hemisphere. Since the Earth's axis precesses relative to the plane of the galaxy, this means we are exactly at the beginning of a north hemisphere ice age. The primary moral of the Book of the Law is do what thou wilt. And because of this unorthodox linchpin of his philosophy, which resembled the will to power described by Friedrich Nietzsche, Crowley, as had Nietzsche before him, proclaimed himself the living embodiment of the Antichrist. This was probably of vanity, but his principle of the law, called thelema, Greek for the will, accounts for this sufficiently. The Roman word, thalamus, meaning bedchamber or sanctuary, is probably a derivation of thelema, since the Romanization of Greek culture was equivalent in many ways to Desade's philosophy in the bedroom. It was for this part of the Roman home that the portion of the brain was named, wherein chemical, electrical, nervous impulses are relayed holographically to and from multiple nerve sources through single nerves. This holographic projection is very important, for it is the prophase of manifestation, and this may be the same channeling of energy described by Nietzsche as the will to power. In fact, it is the philosophies of Desade and Massac that demonstrate the bitter ends of human will, particularly in amorous matters. Therefore, it is important to distinguish between the just wills of Nietzsche and Crowley as Antichrist, as opposed to the corrupt ones of sadomasochists as the archetypes of Satan and Moloch. After Crowley's lifetime, scientists applied genetic research sufficiently to produce an exactly replicated clone of a sheep, which I'm sure he would have smiled upon. The further possibilities for genetic research open up endlessly before our eyes, allowing us free will over biological matters previously considered the domain only of doctors. For example, cures for many modern epidemic diseases will be developed within less time than new epidemic diseases can naturally evolve or change form. The modern method for the treatment of cancer, or the rapid growth of a tumor or lifeless mass from cells that are deprived of oxygen, involves multiple source lasers focused on the tumor using magnetic resonance imaging to create a scalar wave field or area of overlapping rays of extremely high-frequency electromagnetic radiation. This is a far better technique than the primitive practice of giving patients radioactive barium drinks, effectively giving them cancer to treat their cancer. The laser itself derives its name from its function, light-absorbing spectral emission radiation. That is, a mechanical reaction inside the laser source generates a wave of probabilities to move through a wavelength of electrons, absorbing photons along the way to propagate itself. When such a ray reaches the tumor and bounces off other rays like itself, it breaks apart the molecular cohesions of the cell's atoms by causing the electron shells to emit photons. This is a sound cure, though only half as likely to cause radiation-induced cancer relapse as barium, and can be accomplished even more easily and with less risk by mentation through the hands. It is not, however, a prevention of malignant or even benign tumors from forming. A genetic cure for cancer could come from the chromosomes from the pubic hair follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH, that cause inherent stoppage of growth at a predetermined length being implanted in, combined with, the genetic material responsible for the creation, reproduction of the cell wall, such that should the cell reach a certain predetermined maximum tolerable amount of oxygen retention by the cell wall, the nucleus would react by stopping the thickening of the cell wall as it regenerates it, allowing oxygen to evacuate the cell regularly and preventing preemptively the stagnation leading to malignancy. One of the main causes of cancer is cigarette smoking. What would have been fatal doses of tobacco and cocaine were found to have been used in the mummification process of ancient Egypt. Cigarettes also contain arsenic, which is known to kill off the microbacteria in the intestines that cause internal decay after death, as well as being deadly to humans. If there were a cure for cancer, there would be no social movement against cigarettes. Cigarettes are not the only cause of cancer. The dropping of the atomic bomb only marked the beginning of the age of atomic radioactivity. There is more ambient radiation trapped inside the atmosphere by the greenhouse effect now than there has been since the times of the earliest dinosaurs. Much of this is due, ironically, to smog produced by the burning of fossil fuels, comprised of the liquefied body fats of the dinosaurs. This has produced a hole in the ozone layer, letting in even more ultraviolet radiation. In addition to this, the sun is now producing more radiation than it has in the last 2,000 years, as it is at the peak of its sunspot cycle. All of these combined factors make cancer a risk, even from only prolonged exposure to daylight. An ancient technique for life extension involved drinking water with trace amounts of gold in it. These gold atoms were thought to bond with the cell walls of the red and white blood cells and increase their efficacy. The idea of bonding human cells to metal atoms may also be behind the fluoridation, a byproduct of aluminum manufacture, of public water supplies. It is known that the ancient Romans used aqueducts lined with lead, and this led to lead poisoning, an effect similar to arsenic. Many modern scientists predict that in the future much of human biological dependencies will be compensated for by nanobots, or microscopic robots the size of cells, with atomic mechanics that would inhabit the human host's living systems. Karma accumulates in centers of electromagnetic gravitational influx, which often occur along ley line geodesics. As we pass between these, we find our emotions change, our mood changes, and our perception of the world changes as well. This fractures the central personality into the stream of consciousness, and when the brain waves are altered into normalized wave functions, it is easy to go with the flow. These are also the origins of the various different schools of religious thought, as humans migrated along trade routes and moved ideas across the land. So have we learned how tachyons, like the essence of otherness described by Sartre or the spirits described by world religions, reflect in the form of ideological engrams in the neurons of the brain, upon the surface of and affecting the genetic code. Karma is associated with many things, chief amongst them good and evil, but also with the flow of time. It provides us with an excellent example of the same principle behind the anthropomorphism of God, as karma was the first concept to be quantified symbolically. Just as the end-all, be-all idea of God is humanity's own idea of itself, so karma was measured as beads, or spheres, usually along a string. While this idea was busy leading to the abacus in the Orient, it led to the Last Judgment scenario through Egypt into the West, where all of our good deeds and all of our bad deeds are measured against one another, and this determines if we spend eternity in a paradise or being tortured. Even though it was Jesus himself who overturned the tables of the money changers in the temple of God, Christians unanimously view him as the one to return and judge them according to their accumulations of karma. In truth, there is no real human God, and there is no ideal particle. Other than these two concepts, religion has no basis at all in all the history of humanity. What there is known to be, however, has only been proven by other people's obsession with the opposite concept, a real universe and an ideal God, an agnostic spirit that eludes humanity's grasp and at the same time is capable of fulfilling humanity's wishes. This is the same concept as karma, only with a psychological personality, and either a deistic faith or a belief in cosmically nascent emotions is only another foil of genocentric anthropomorphism. Even the concept that time is the blood of God still implies that God bleeds and can therefore be killed, which is impossible since there is no such thing in reality. Similarly, the concept of God as the rule of irony leaves open the legal loophole that even the law of irony can be broken, and is thus not absolute. The fact that there are real particles, as first predicted by the classical Greek atomist philosophers, at least proves that karma, in an amoral, non-ideal sense, is a reality, and that even human beings are composed of very small particles and waves of pure probabilistic information. In that it is taken as the mechanism for cause and effect, karma cannot be considered a moral ideal, though, because it is equivalent in quantum mechanics as a rule over time to the uncertainty principle, or the axiom that cause and effect occur at random, and due to what is, quantifiably, nothing. According to an application of irony, the existentialists believed that existence preceded essence, and only then could people use their free will to determine for each individual person whether God exists. At the same time as this great modern philosophy was being cranked out, the existence of real particles of karma was being used to argue that there is no order to the universe, ergo God. To put this in terms both the clergy and lay scientists can understand, the randomness of real particles of karma, as being the lesser or more base and profane aspect of the law of God, disproves the existence of God as a primary motivator or intervening legislator. Quantum mechanics delves even deeper into existentialism, though disagreeing with its central premise by saying that the essence of the continuum, quantum waves, did in fact pre-exist solid particles that form the nuclei of atoms, which form the macromolecules of matter. Therefore, it is safe for modern scientists to say that electrons are older than photons, in the same way that astrophysicists have determined that black holes are older than living stars. This is because, just as a black hole once was a star, an electron goes through many different energy levels in its history as it absorbs and emits photons. If electrons are, indeed, older than other solid quanta, this may explain their state of flux between particle and wave. Electrons are raw potential energy, and therefore can be either a probability cloud in which the charge is dispersed as an electrical field, or it can react as a particle, reflecting another solid particle off its surface. It is important to remember that electrons are both particle and wave, because one is a spike in the wave function representing probability, and the other is a waveform frequency of pure potential. While it is in the form of an orbital shell around a nucleus, an electron occupies all points on all orbital paths simultaneously. Imagine a soap bubble. It is the same air inside and outside, but the surface is a seething fractal of patterns and colors. This is like an electron. An electron is like a bubble, the same inside and outside, but in the case of the electron, this is electromagnetic energy. Just as the bubble's surface integrity is maintained by air pressure, so too do the conditions of the inside and the outside of an electron equal one another quantitatively. However, here is where the electron differs from a bubble. Inside of an electron bubble, the electromagnetic radiation is a negatively charged probability, while outside the electron bubble, the electromagnetic radiation is positively charged potential. Because its surface is acting as an inversion between these two descriptions of the same microwave gravitational force, the electron manifests electrical charge. As I said, the charge of the electron occupies all points on the orbital shell, or bubble, ubiquitously, but the electrical force carries with it the magnetic force. Because the charge of the electron can be at any point, and the axis of orbital polarity is always perpendicular to it, then there are infinite possible positions for the magnetic poles of an electron, and we can also say that the electron therefore possesses infinite potential spin, or vector. In the metaphor of the bubble, the fluid dynamics of the oil on the surface of the sphere would represent the electron cloud's probability. If you poke something through the surface of a soap bubble, you will see the effervescent oil slick cohere homogeneously towards that point. This is similar to the reaction of the electron cloud when acted upon by a real particle, such as a photon. Ordinarily, the probability curve of the electron cloud would measure something like a square well, or, in other words, existing for a fixed duration of time. However, we have no way of knowing if this is the case or not, because of the uncertainty principle. According to the laws of the uncertainty principle, it is possible to measure only either an electron's trajectory, spin, or velocity, frequency, because whichever one you are observing, and can factor in geometric conservation for, the other is changed relative to the conservation effect of the first. What this means, in effect, is that When a photon strikes the surface of the electron cloud, the electrical charge coalesces into one more probable orbital history than any other, so that it has an effect on the frequency and the reflected trajectory of the photon equivalent to its own frequency and trajectory. However, in that those of the electron change those of the photon, so do those of the photon change those of the electron. And since the charge immediately fades back into a cloud of potential energy, there is no way to measure any such predictable change in the orbital path of the electron. The reason for this is that the charge of the electron is one-dimensional. When it is struck by a three-dimensional particle, its collapse into an orbital plane makes it second-dimensional. Because of its minimum possible duration, it is a temporally singular event, and this adds the dimension of time as the electron's third dimension, allowing it to act as a particle opposite the three-dimensional particle of a photon. The temporal singularity of the electron mirrors its singularity as a point, and this wave function of probability can be measured as a short, sharp spike rather than a square well. Because the electron's charge is massless, it is the same size as a singularity. This is a difficult concept for many modern scholars to grasp, since we are told that a singularity is a point so infinitely small that it bends space-time in upon itself and produces the massive gravitational effect of black holes, and we do not see this same effect occurring with electrons. Here we must remember that if a singularity had spin, it would have mass, while the electron has spin and yet has no mass. Instead, it has an electromagnetic charge. While the singularity operates as a quantum dynamo for the gravitational force, each electron carries an infinite potential amount of energy. If it weren't for the mathematics telling us there was something there, an electron might as well not exist for us, as there is no way that we can yet directly perceive it. For this reason, based on their two-dimensionality as charge and orbital trajectory, electrons are considered virtual particles, that is, waveforms of energy with fractional spin, existing only halfway in the material universe. As a cloud of potential, they are not even measurable probability. The best way for people to understand the electron is to visualize how the gas cloud around stars gradually, over billions of years, coalesces into the spherical planets orbiting the star at their different orbital distances and speeds. This is the change an electron undergoes whenever it is struck by a photon. What this spike well waveform means is that the duration of the electron's concentration into a point is of the minimum possible duration. In other words, it is only while the photon and the electron are actually in contact with one another that the existence of the electron can be measured. During this time, it can be expressed as several different reactions to the photon's internal spin and projected trajectory. The only one I have described is the effect of the electron coming to a point equivalent in size to a singularity, except containing an electrical charge. Also, as I have said, according to the uncertainty principle, only either the frequency of the wavelength history of the electrical charge or the projected trajectory of the magnetic polar orbital rotation of the electron point can be measured at one time by the impact of a photon, because the impact of the photon changes these characteristics of the electron after reflection. The way that these are measured is by the amount of change to the opposite characteristics of the photon, where the trajectory spin of the electron changes the photon's wavelength, and the wavelength of the electron changes the photon's spin, or vice versa. The change to an electron's spin is therefore a precise geometric function relative to the spin of the photon colliding with it, and these changes in trajectory can therefore be measured using quantum mechanics wave mathematics. Ordinarily, when the electron is in its square-well state as a cloud of potential energy, with the electrical charge dispersed throughout the surface of its orbital shell, there are infinite potential magnetic poles for it to be orbiting around. However, if the electron is brought into relationship with other electrons by a magnetic field, such that its magnetic polarity becomes a fixed function relative to all the other electrons around it, then it becomes possible to observe a single orbital trajectory of the electron charge as a point on the surface of the orbital shell. However, while it is still a cloud of potential, the electrical charge will seem to occupy all points on the surface of the orbital shell at once, because of the velocity at which it is traveling that orbital trajectory. In this case, if the electron cloud were struck by a photon, only a small fraction of the electron's orbital trajectory could be projected, because it would not be known if the orbit of the electrical charge would change relative to the magnetic pole. The best way to answer this question is to study electrons in aggregate groups called fields. We find electromagnetic fields around every living thing, around the Earth, and around the Sun. While all of these share polarity, the orbital trajectories the electrons take as they cycle through them are determined primarily by external factors. The aura of living things is fluid and obtuse, while of those artificial things imbued with charge, rigid and precise. The ionosphere of the Earth seems more or less stationary, but that of the Sun coils up due to the differential rotation of the gaseous fusion engine. It is probably this last model that best reflects the behavior of the electron charge in its orbital shell. The pattern of the electromagnetic field lines of the Sun, and of the projected trajectory of an electron charge in its orbital shell around the nucleus, begins at one pole and spirals around the sphere into concentric circles until it gets to the other pole. It is not known what the electrical charge does when it gets to this point, but it is known from the passing of an electrical charge as a current through electrons aligned by a magnetic field that this is how the force of electromagnetic radiation is transported. The dependence on the use of a photon as activator for the measurement of the properties of an electron is similar to the fetish of modern astrophysicists insisting on describing only the effects of a black hole on a biological physical body, rather than performing a thought experiment on them in the laboratory of the mind. It is a malfunction of modern machinery that cannot be expected to endure as a restriction. The human mind is a very sensitive entity, and this means that it empathizes, even if only unconsciously, with every change in the environment it is within. The description of an electron being struck by a photon, therefore, equates in the emotional mind to the stoning of sinners, and there is a knee-jerk reaction to the nascent enlightenment involved with prayer upon some moral cliché like, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. Neither of these viewpoints is correct. Neither dependence upon the use of photon intervention to realize the properties of an electron, nor the idea that there is implied by this dependency the inverse necessity of its prohibition. Photons are going to come into contact with electrons as long as there are photons and electrons, and when they do, they will always have the same, basically predictable, results. We are not responsible for having first caused this condition of the universe to come about simply due to our meager understanding of it, and what universal effect our knowledge of the use and abuse of it may have remains to be seen. The observed effects researchers have collected data for using quantum probability as the unit of measurement are that when a photon strikes an electron, it can do one of two things. It can be reflected, that is, the electron can act as another three-dimensional particle and bounce the photon's projected trajectory off its orbital shell's surface, or it can be absorbed, causing the orbital shell of the electron to expand to a higher energy level. If an electron's orbital shell level is not on the baseline frequency of the lowest energy shell level, then it can also emit a photon if struck by another photon. The idea that one particle that has whole number spin in 3 dimensions and another particle that can act as a similar particle, a solid against which another solid can reflect, can also dissolve together into a new function that acts entirely like a wave, is an astounding concept. However, according to the principles of relativity, which states that matter and energy are relative, and that of uncertainty, which states that potential energy and probability wells are interchangeable over time, this is a simple fact of natural science. As I described earlier, the photon carries no charge, and therefore what it is contributing to the energy of the electron is the radiation of tachyons. When these are absorbed into the field of potential of the electron cloud, it increases its distance from the nucleus and maintains the same velocity, or increases its velocity and keeps the same distance, but to find out one would have to measure it again, and to do so would disturb it, and thus change its conditions. Because the electron's positions of orbital shells are determined by the micro-wavelengths of tachyons emanating into the nucleus, when more are combined with them from the potential of a photon, it simply serves to lengthen the measure of the wavelengths of tachyons and move the electron's orbital shell out further from the nucleus. In order to compensate for the additional energy, the electron moves over a greater distance in its orbital trajectory in the same amount of time. However, if there is not another electron that stays as a placeholder in the base energy level state, the electron will emit the photon and fall back down to the lower energy level shell. The reason quantum mathematics indicates the electron changes orbital energy level shell when it absorbs a photon is the conservation of spin. When the electron absorbs the photon, it absorbs its particle spin and wave trajectory components, and this additional information expands the parameters of the orbital shell. This demonstrates a rule with 2 particles that quantum physicists believe still applies even if there is only one particle or wave contributing effect, the law of reverse spin. According to this outlandish axiom, in potential, every particle is moving in the exact opposite way as probability allows us to observe. The reason we are observing things spinning the directions they do is because this reverse spin is conserved on a higher dimensional level. When 2 particles with different spins, such as in particular the photon and the electron, interact, they represent 2 reverse spins combining to form a higher dimensional spin. And this accounts for the effect of the increased information expanding the electron's orbital shell. When a photon is absorbed and emitted from an electron cloud, it happens so fast it is virtually simultaneous. This gives the effect that the photon, as a particle, is bouncing off the electron, which it is thought would have to be acting like a particle. I have demonstrated how this is merely a function of the factoring in of information from various different dimensions of spin, and we see that it is these same factors of spin that are changed by the collision and reflect combined trajectory spin. These change for both the photon and the electron. However, it is only by weighing the measurements of spin as dimensions for a photon and then bouncing it off an electron and subtracting the change that we can currently comprehend the characteristics of the electron beforehand and doing so changes these characteristics for the electron. So, while our knowledge of the whole number spin particle photon can be more or less absolute, our knowledge of the electron is confined by the uncertainty principle to be incomplete. What we can observe are the three precise factors of spin that can be cataloged according to the first three dimensions, and relate these two between the photon and the electron. Therefore, we can make predictions for both based on the measurements obtained from either. Two fractional spin virtual electrons do not make a whole spin real photon, unless they are both orbiting the same nucleus and one is emitted as a photon. The quarks and gluons and other quanta inside an atomic nucleus are held together very much like the electrons in orbital shells surrounding them that can combine with other atoms to form molecules. Other than this, the various gauge bosons, mesons, protons, and neutrinos are all more or less free particles that do not bind together except as upon wavelengths to transmit a carrier force. Photons are one such boson, or large real particle, with long vectors and wavelength histories so long they comprise the spectrum of visible light, which is only a little bit shorter than audible sound waves, which are so long in frequency that they actually disrupt the particles of air, which are macromolecules of oxygen atoms and water molecules. In other words, even though it is of a size that it can interact with an electron, which is the same massless size as a singularity, or hole in space-time, a photon is still one of the larger quantum particles that occupy Hilbert space. In the light of relativity, physicists seeking a general unified field theory concluded that the emission of very large particles from radioactive elements undergoing decay is equivalent to the propagation of force through the continuum of smaller elements such as the large photons and the very small electrons. However, following this, their attempts to find a very large particle responsible for the propagation of the force of gravity over vast distances has failed. This, it is believed, would unify both the strong and the weak nuclear force to the electromagnetic spectrum. However, there already is a form of radiation that, according to superstring theory, some scientists are coming to believe may be responsible for the propagation of the gravitational force. It may be because of this form of radiation that the large, real photon can interact with the infinitely small, massless electron. In the same way that an electron is a force-carrying wave form of the electromagnetic spectrum, so is a photon a force-carrying particle of that same form of energy. Just as an electron carries a charge, a photon carries light. Just as a charge can be passed along a series of electrons arranged in a magnetic field, so is it by the motions of photons along wavelengths of light rays that everything we see is brought to our eyes. Just as radio waves are actuated by the propagation of an electrical charge, and so it is now thought for large particle radioactive decay, so are photons the carrier particles for the propagation of radiation. Many photons begin their lives as the potential electrical charge of an electron. In the same way that an electron is represented over time as a wavelength of energy, so also is the trajectory of a photon or other real particle over time measured as a wavelength. In both cases, this is a two-dimensional wavelength, unless it is a factor of vector in 3 dimensions, including particle spin, polar displacement, orbital rotation, surface vector, and projected trajectory, wavelength history. If the electron cloud is moving, it will possess these traits, and if the photon is moving, it will possess these traits. These wavelength histories are associated with the electromagnetic spectrum, but such are the measure of the force-carrying particles of all four elemental forces, and these are all the particles that are known. Therefore, wavelengths represent a sort of unification of the four elemental forces, and in a way a transcendence, revealing that underlying all of these is dimensionality itself. While cosmologists now believe that the four elemental forces originally diverged from one another due to the separation of matter and energy, it is also believed that energy pre-existed matter, and that, through the process of matter-energy exchange, all existing matter will eventually return to energy. In fact, even the matter that does exist does not exist for very long, and it is only because matter is being continually passed through phases of energy that it is ever created more often than it is destroyed. While both exist, they interact. The waves of emanation form fields of potential, while the spinning real particles form probability wells. Everything looks much the same on the atomic scale as on the interstellar scale, although much, much more active. So it is with matter and electromagnetic energy, and the greater wavelengths of dimensional planes comprising the higher function of their geometrical organization. Such wavelengths are best evidenced in tachyons, the microwavelengths that compress the vacuum of uncertainty into a solid particle of light. Just like the water from a waterfall appears continuous, so too do the wavelengths of the electromagnetic spectrum appear continuous. However, when the water in a waterfall is exposed to strobe light, it becomes clear that the water is comprised of discontinuous droplets, each one self-contained and separate from the others. Similarly, if you reduce the frequency of electromagnetic radiation to a single pulse, the spirals of the dimensional waves will combine to form the spin of a singular quantum particle. This is the way to distinguish between the frequencies of matter, which exist only as the measure at any one time from one peak to the next or from one trough to the next, apart from the wavelengths of energy that take up a whole series of peaks and troughs in potential. Science has discovered what mathematics predicted, that inside each quantum packet of dimensional spin wavelengths, there are smaller such wavelengths acting upon and permeating the quantum information units, and these comprise individual particles of even smaller quanta, the microwave tachyons. In the case of photons, what we are actually seeing is the concentration of tachyons in a vortex at such a frequency that they actually solidify uncertainty, causing it to radiate or emit tachyons. When the photon moves through space, it is really these tachyon microwavelengths transporting the probability for such a spherical solid along an emanation of force propagation. In the same way that the radioactivity of large particle elements, the radio transmission on electromagnetic bandwidths, and the radiation of emitted photons are all considered synonymous, so microwavelength tachyons may be considered gravitational radiation. These are equivalent to superstrings that propagate in dense ultrafine wavelengths upon dimensional planes in resonant frequency forms, and therefore manifest a particle force carrier. My theories regarding tachyons are based on the comparison of three separate theories and studies. These are, in no particular order, a study conducted by a laboratory in America that showed that, when projected through a solid medium, it was possible to propel an electromagnetic wavelength faster than the speed of light. The description by Robert Lazar of lenticular anti-gravity craft that use microwave technology propulsion systems, and the theory of tachyons as a faster-than-light particle. The rest of my descriptions are based on extrapolative interpolations of geometry on the predicted behaviors of such a theoretical particle. Let me repeat this. The tachyon is a theoretical particle. Despite the study of micro-wavelengths, there is no public scientific link between the concept of microwave energy and the scientifically theoretical faster-than-light particle popularly known as the tachyon. However, to say this goes against the modern scientific community, because it has only been recently that the weak nuclear force has been associated with the electromagnetic force, and this has been a concession on the side of very large particles rather than ultrafine energy. Furthermore, the search for a graviton as a force-carrying particle for gravity has been based on its being thought to be a very large particle as well, since the force that it propagates affects very large scales. In other words, I represent a very special link through which these three fields of research can come together. However, to me, they are only one idea out of many, many millions more in potential. The stage is set for much bolder research to come. However, for now, the limitations are largely mechanical. Because of the nature of our own minds, we are being forced to confront the constituent components of the more and more finite dimensions as pure data, for we have no other method with which to perceive beyond the lowest levels. Therefore, tachyons can remain a theory, irregardless of my facts and research, just as well as they can remain a fact, regardless of all the failed attempts at proving them or disproving them thus far by the rest of the scientific community. What it means for a tachyon to move faster than the speed of light is that the information unit of its carrier particle would reach a destination before a wavelength of photons emitted at the same time from the same source, from the same distance, through any medium. If you consider the fact that photons are the carrier particles for the entire electromagnetic spectrum, from very fast ultraviolet to very slow infrared, at a speed faster than known to be traveled by any other particle or form of radiated energy, then to say that tachyons travel faster isn't really like saying that tachyons just break the light barrier, as much as like saying that tachyons break the law of entropy, or the forward flow of space-time, since photons are the fastest form of particle decay and energy redistribution. In reality, this is not the case, since, as a form of microwave energy, tachyons merely represent a faster form of entropy, but according to general relativity, which also introduced the gravitational constant, this was considered very much the case for anything that challenged the fixed constant of the speed of light. In other words, to say that tachyons move backward in time might be considered at best an illusion, and at worst an anachronism of absurd axioms. However, this is, in fact, exactly what they do, since they involute upon themselves in a torus shape, tunneling through from the top pole to the bottom pole as they are projected through space. At the same time that their outside moves forward in time along its projected trajectory, their inside moves backward. When one of these is expanded into a wormhole, it is possible for someone to enter it and travel through space-time. Although it is only due to a quirk of its geometry that an individual tachyon can be thought of as traveling simultaneously forwards and backwards in time, it is a very real fact that this theoretical particle, because it has not been proven, exists outside the material domain. No known particle can be projected faster than a photon. When any other form of particle is sped up towards the speed of light, it disintegrates, its cinders impacting with equivalent-sized particles with opposite spin. The idea that a particle is traveling faster than a photon is derived entirely from the ancient belief in an astral light and spiritual realm. Can you see by the light of a single photon? It is a packet of information, a collection in 3 dimensions of different spin vectors, whose combined effect measures as its projected trajectory and illumination. This combined unit of information is the light by which we see a photon, and it is by the light of photons that we know the world. Each one of the vectors of the 3 separate dimensions of the real photon comprises its own micro wavelength, and each one of these is the history of a tachyon. It is probably the same tachyon that we are seeing, only intermittently hidden from view in another dimension, appearing like a pulsar. A tachyon is more than just a particle traveling faster than light. It represents a particle that can flow opposite the direction of the projected trajectory of the particle emitting it, and therefore opposite the flow of entropy as defined by a photon. Therefore, it is a particle of time. That is, it is a meta-object of the 4th dimension. Because they are moving against the wake of fluid dynamic entropy, the theoretical particle of the tachyon would create a counterspin equal and opposite to that force in which it was in suspension. This would mean that it would be a force that moved opposite the standard cause and effect progression of the rest of the entropic forces, which all radiate outward from a central point. This force would have to attract and pull exactly opposite these other forces' standard flow of progressive entropy. The force that we can see doing this now is gravity. It is still generally thought that the graviton particle would be a large particle, since its force is propagated on the scale of planets, stars, and galaxies. However, as an energy, such as a micro-wavelength between quanta, all that a tachyon would need to be able to propagate force on very large scales would be to act upon a fractal framework, or pattern of mnemonic or exponential expansion. And in fact, we do see all of these things happening. Because tachyons would, theoretically, propagate faster than the speed of light that defines the material horizon of our 3-dimensional universe, they involute faster than the parameters of the real universe and exist outside of and beyond it. Most attempts at accelerating particles to the speed of light result in explosion, an effect known as antimatter, as probabilities and their exact inversions collide. Tachyons would, theoretically, implode so fast that they would finish before they started, and would thus be invisible. All the lesser results were called antimatter, and it is important to remember that tachyons are an anti-energy. Mathematically, they are still more complex than this, as their insides are moving backwards through time at the combined speed of both their external influx and their frequency of projected trajectory, which is obviously faster than their external surface involution alone when they are in motion. There is a specific bending of the quantum uncertainty of the fabric of the space-time continuum into a phi over pi spiral on the surface of a torus, and in this we see that the phi involution moves a greater distance in the same amount of time, and therefore is moving faster than the outside revolution of the pi-bound surface. Therefore, even if what we were seeing were only a photon with an electromagnetic charge, and the surface of the tachyon were traveling at the speed of light, the inside of it would still be traveling faster than the speed of light, and therefore entropy, and therefore would be moving backward in time. The torus is the shape of a hypersphere at antipode. If a tachyon is involuting backwards through time, and is therefore like a particle of time, then its shape must be a metaform, or 4th-dimensional solid. These are known by their 3rd-dimensional shadows, such as the hypercube, or cube within a cube, and hypersphere, or sphere within a sphere. When these 4th-dimensional shapes are moved through the virtual plane of the 3rd dimension, the metaforms of their shadows in 3 dimensions change. The hypercube becomes the cube the double cube, the tesseract, and hypercross, the hypersphere becomes the sphere and the torus. The pattern of a vector on the surface of such a particle is a phi over pi spiral, as it follows pi upward and around the outside of the surface, and then phi down into the center of the upper pole and through to below. If it were seen from the side, a tachyon would probably appear like a sphere, if it even appeared at all. Like the electron, it would be comprised of a singularity-sized point with the polarity fixed by trajectory in a differentially rotating pi orbital path around the surface of a spherical probability well. However, while the very large photon and very small electron are still of relative size, what they share in common is their substance, tachyons. The photon emits tachyons, and the electron's orbital energy level shell is based upon them. Therefore, it is natural for the tachyons to have the same behavior as both the photon as a real particle and the electron as a wave of potential. This is what is expressed in their combined external spin, projected trajectory, and involuting influx. As the whole of the tachyon's outer surface differentially rotates in a tightly coiled pi spiral from the past to the future pole, it simultaneously slices through the center of the tachyon in a phi spiral to emerge from the past pole. Similarly, if a particle possessing exact counterspin to a tachyon were created, it would lead into the future. This is more theoretical than even the theoretical tachyons themselves, though. Instead, the function of the tachyons seems to be to establish and preserve order through gravitation, opposite the dissolution of entropy, so that things stay as much the same from moment to moment as possible. This is the most theoretical extent of all their possible applications, and acts as much the same as Einstein's gravitational constant, or the ancient concept of the ether as a unified field, or spirit as the unification of the four elements. The places from which we find tachyons emitting in space are black holes' gas jets, which are ejected from the poles of spinning black holes as they accelerate all the matter energy they consume to asymptotically faster than the speed of light, and only a few tachyons escape. Inside the tachyon surface of the black hole, that makes it absorb photon light and gives black holes their name, is the gravitational singularity that began accumulating mass by spinning. The tachyon surface itself is called the event horizon, because inside of it is an event that is taking place outside the confines of the visible material universe. It is defined by the Schwarzschild radius, which is a function of the spin of the singularity. However, the surface of it is similar to a soap bubble, just like an electron. Here we see the infinite potential dimensions of the multiverse, each leading to its own universe, all gravity distortions to the surface of space-time. To enter into any one of these universes is to be pulled into the singularity, and the matter energy of your mass to be converted into its inversion in the baby universe, unless you are made of tachyons and can escape the gravitational pull, in which case it is possible to find oneself exiting from another point in the same universe, far away from the tachyons around the black hole. It is also possible, again by using tachyons, to create such a dimensional warping effect in space without the presence of a gravitational singularity. Ironically, because tachyons are contrary to uncertainty as having constant characteristics, they are considered improbable and therefore remain theoretical, because of the fact that they cannot exist according to the laws in this reality. They have no history. This is merely a further characteristic of their dimensionality, in that a particle that cannot exist in the moment cannot exist from one moment to the next. Therefore, tachyons are considered to be removed from and beyond the confines of not only the first three dimensions, being its polarity, orbit, and involution, but from the fourth temporal dimension as well, because its shape is based on a metaform, or the third-dimensional shadow of a fourth-dimensional form, and the particle itself is removed from even the fourth dimension, then we are truly looking at something fifth-dimensional here, and that seems to agree with the harmonic octave and divided decade forms of the elements of the material universe. To imagine this form of anti-history, think of a standard spiraling wavelength measuring the forward flow of charge to the vector of a particle over time. Now imagine that this is an exactly flat electromagnetic field line. This is where tachyons occur, where we see micro-wavelength electromagnetic radiation sped up beyond the speed of light, such as in the gas jets of a black hole. In the same way that the electron warps magnetism, the spinning singularity warps space-time, and tachyons warp time-space. The electron warps magnetism through tachyons, a singularity warps space-time through gravity, and tachyons warp time-space through the matter-energy exchange that is reality's cause and effect. In that they are free of the rules of the fourth dimension, they are bound exclusively to it for their form, which is expressed as potential radiation. Tachyons are exclusively waves, in the same way that photons are exclusively particles, and electrons can act as either. For this reason, they propagate force according to the underlying geometries of the fourth dimension. Electrons, being half like them in this respect, but confined to temporal finitude by their third-dimensional solid counterparts, are also fields of pure potential energy. In the fourth dimension, there is infinite potential energy. In the fifth dimension, there is infinite potential spin. The manifestation of such spin within the realm of potential energy is a tachyon. The manifestation of such energy in the realm of the real third dimension is an electron. As I have already described, the best-known source of faster-than-light radiation in the universe is in the gas jets emitting from the poles of rotating black holes. Black holes rotate, and as they do, they speed up all the matter energy approaching them to the speed of light, and convert it all into ultraviolet light. Behind this, the light is accelerated even further. However, this is the limit of the Schwarzschild radius, and we can see no more beyond it with modern instruments. If we could, we would see that inside is a mass of churning wormholes, tachyons perpetually inflating and deflating, all leading to the singularity, where a baby universe, inflated by the consumed mass, bubbles off from the surface of space-time. The tachyon's rotation is counter the rotation of the photons being absorbed because it inverts the information of their spin from matter into energy, and for this reason the tachyon surface of the event horizon rotates differentially around the black hole like the electromagnetic field of a star. When it gets to the poles, however, it cannot tunnel through to the pole at the opposite side, as the torus pattern of the individual tachyon seems to indicate, and it is no more likely for the tachyons on the surface to open up and fall in towards the singularity at these points than at any other, and so the effect is that some of the tachyons escape. The electromagnetic field lines invert their direction and extend out in perfectly straight lines from the poles. What we are seeing in the gas jets of a black hole is much like what we see in the accretion disk of the black hole, which is, ironically, a lot of iron. It is not because of the mass of the iron atoms that they are prevalent in the ultraviolet corona of the black hole and may also be common in the gas jets, but because they can carry an electromagnetic charge and may therefore be acting as a conductor for tachyons. Then we would see their behavior is similar to ashes dancing around a fire, carried in the convection currents. Further, we see that a solid medium is necessary to conduct microwave-length energy faster than the speed of light. It is in this form that the black hole vents its excess energy, that is, whatever it consumes more than it can digest at the same time, and stabilizes itself relative to the progressive flow of entropy. The event horizon is the boundary of the mass of the black hole, defined by the barrier of its gravitational inversion of matter energy to beyond the speed of light, known as the Schwarzschild radius. The surface of this is black because it even absorbs photons, but just above this is a photosphere where the matter it is consuming is being spun up and dragged around it at asymptotically the speed of light. This light is transparent, however, since it is all being dragged back down to the surface of the black hole. Around the black hole is an ultraviolet corona of particles being sped up to the speed of light and pulled very rapidly into it. It is by this light that it is possible to see the effects of the gravitational inversion beyond light are having on the clear light halo of the very dark sphere. On the black hole's surface are an infinite number of tachyons, each swirling inward towards the black hole and outward from it at the same time. These are warped around the surface of it so that there are an infinite number around the edge of the visible curvature of its face, and only one very large one expanded into a wormhole at the nearest point. Nothing about this description contradicts anything astrophysicists predict about black holes. In fact, it is a confirmation of their repeated descriptions of the effects on a clock of it being dropped into a black hole. According to these descriptions, the clock would slow down as it passed the event horizon, until eventually it would stop altogether when it reached the singularity. This is merely their allegory to illustrate that time would have stopped, and in truth the clock would have been smashed into atoms before it could even get close to the event horizon. Tachyons are the product of very short wavelength, high-frequency microwaves, traveling through the electrons of a solid medium. If there were a chain of electrons arranged pole to pole, and a tachyon were traveling through them, it would follow not only the flat line history of jumping from the point of one pole to the next, that is only the internal involution of the tachyon. Its surface would also undulate over and under the external surfaces of all the electron clouds, without disturbing them from their orbital shells. Thus, to create a tachyon, one would have to project not one microwave length, but two identical opposite frequencies, in perfect symmetry pairing, from between which the tachyon would emerge. This is called a null wave, and the tachyon the zero-point energy. Experimentation of this nature using harmonic scalar waves has been ongoing since the turn of the 20th century. Tachyons also occur in the neuron stacks, columns, and pillars of the brain. The potential energy carried inside the myelin sheath from axon to dendrites in each nerve of the nervous system also creates tachyons, as does the fibrillation of the heart. In addition to the particles I have listed, there are many others that can be classified as belonging to the electromagnetic spectrum, and these are all force carriers for the fifth force that unifies the other four, the force of light. It is light that causes gravity in the form of tachyons. It is light that strikes and bends electric charge, and the electric charge is light. It is light that is generated when two particles are fused together, and light that knocks the nuclei out of other atoms. The force of light has been known throughout history as being associated with the concept of the ideal. For example, to carry a torch for someone is still considered noble. The spirit is called the light body, or body of light. Nowadays, science knows of many properties of light, but it is only the tip of the iceberg. The work on resonant harmonic variable frequencies is literally music to the ears. It is also becoming clear that the work on holographs and holograms will yield us representations in virtual reality of the resonant metaforms of higher dimensions, such as fractals already have for quaternions. The force of light is not just the force of electromagnetic radiation. It is also the large particles of radioactive decay and the superstrings of gravity. Light, in its fine aspect, however, as an electrical charge with magnetic potential, can be found present in particles from every one of the four forces, while it is absent in only a few particles, such as the photon, in which it is replaced by radiation. Entropy is often associated with the linear polarity of time, and in this way time is often thought of as being linear and one-directional. This leads to the concept of the continuum of space-time being the two-dimensional surface of a three-dimensional universe expanding in the fourth dimension. This seems like a fairly straightforward description, except that, in 3 dimensions, the universe appears to be expanding outward in all directions at once. If Earth were only a point on the surface of an expanding sphere, then perpendicular to the surface of space-time, there would be no other stellar bodies until the opposite surface of the sphere. This is obviously not the case. This is because it is not the 3rd dimension that is expanding. This is only what appears to be happening because it is thought that the Doppler effect is responsible for the red shifting of the photon emission spectrum of intergalactic light. However, this is an optical illusion. The expansion is actually going on in the 4th spatial dimension, which underlies the 3 dimensions that we perceive, and is the substance of the surface of space-time that is made visible in photons and measured by the speed of light. The substance is pure potential energy, and the motion through it is light, not only in the form of photons, but in the form of tachyons. It is the self-propagation of these tachyons holographically that causes the universe to expand, and is responsible for the effect of entropy, or the 4th temporal dimension's passage through us. It is now possible to predict, based on different possible geometries for space-time and the observed mass and age of the universe, according to the laws of physics, if and when our universe will end. This factors into similar eschatological systems. Rather than either expanding indefinitely and fizzling out, or collapsing inward and compressing back into nothing, the voids in the walls and filaments might be seen as expanding hollow mnemonic forms, and even the photons themselves on their carrier waves of superstring tachyons might amount to only Maya, or illusion. One such system is the Mayan, which dates 3 previous destructions of the world, each by a different element, and another to occur on December 12, 2012 Gregorian, the last by fire. Another is the Hindu system, which describes how the universe is a dream in the mind of God, and ends when he awakens. When the energy of light moves through the lower dimensions, from the 1st dimensional electrical charge to the 4th dimensional probability cloud, it creates a whirling spiral concourse, and this is measured as spin. Spin is measured as an effect in the other dimensions, but since even 5th dimensional tachyons possess involution spin, it is a cause in a dimension above all the rest. Without light acting as an intermediate carrier dimension between it and the manifest realm, it would have no effect, however, and the temporal aspect of the 4th spatial dimension would end. According to the standard aging of stars, those in the galaxies furthest away from us, and most of those even only a few 100 million light-years away, are already dead, and this wave of destruction is sweeping through the universe towards us, behind and beneath the illusion of light they gave off so long ago. As I have described, entropy is a function of the temporal involution of the universe through infinite potential tachyons. History itself is going through this time tunnel, leading as much from the more disordered future to the more ordered present, as from the more disordered past to the more ordered present. There is no question as to the history of karma. What goes around comes around. Right before anything became past, it was the future. There is no such thing as the here and now. Time can be stopped in death. In this state, the spirit can perceive itself as apart from the body. It moves freely. The mind is just its shadow. The flowing stream of the font of consciousness is a well at the surface of an underground spring, and the spirit is the radiation of ley lines out from it. Nietzsche said, "Man is a rope stretched across the abyss." Many people have read Nietzsche and have found themselves as such. Thus, they constitute the fibrous network of the multiverse, a dimension accessible through the relaxed concentration of consciousness. The only thing hindering the common person from achieving their daydreams is moral guilt for being able to have them. Otherwise, we would all be able to freely admit to one another that we can see through each other's eyes. Our hearts beat with one another. We even breathe with one another. Rhythms flow through us and between one another. Spirits are living karma that can move about between people in the form of consequence. Our phi over pi genetic coded DNA is manifest spirit. It is both matter and spirit, form and function, monkey and God.